After my husband's inheritance was divided, my daughter-in-law waved the keys. "The Miami mansion is ours, except that you lost, you useless old woman." The whole family laughed. I just smiled and said, "Actually, there's someone you need to meet first." She froze, as if her heart had stopped. At that moment, an unknown man walked through the door and they screamed, "What the hell? I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." I never thought my husband's funeral would be the last time I felt truly loved by my own family. 3 weeks later, sitting in that sterile conference room at Morrison & Associates law firm, I watched my son Michael avoid my eyes, while his wife Eleni practically vibrated with excitement beside him. The mahogany table stretched between us like a chasm. On one side sat my late husband Henry's family, his brother Robert, sister Patricia, and their adult children. On the other side, Michael and Eleni, her manicured fingers drumming against her designer purse, and there was me, at the end of the table, feeling like an afterthought at my own husband's will reading. Attorney James Morrison cleared his throat and opened the thick folder before him. "Thank you all for gathering today. As you know, we're here to execute the last will and testament of Henry William Crawford, who passed away on October 15th. My heart still clenched whenever I heard those words. Henry had been everything to me for 42 years. The man who held my hand through 3 miscarriages before Michael was finally born. The man who worked double shifts at the steel mill so I could stay home and raise our boy. The man who never once made me feel like I wasn't enough, even when his family made it clear they thought he'd married beneath himself. "I'll read the provisions in order," Morrison continued. His voice seemed distant, like he was speaking through water. "To my beloved brother Robert Crawford, I leave my collection of vintage tools and my 1967 Mustang, with the hope that you'll restore her to her former glory." Robert's face broke into a genuine smile. He and Henry had spent countless weekends in the garage, working on cars together. It was a perfect gift, and I found myself smiling despite the heaviness in my chest. "To my sister Patricia, I leave my mother's jewelry collection and the sum of $50,000. Patricia pressed her hand to her heart, tears gathering in her eyes. Henry had always been thoughtful with his gifts, even in death. Morrison continued reading smaller bequests to nephews and nieces. Each gift was carefully chosen, meaningful. That was Henry. He never did anything without purpose. Then Morrison's tone shifted slightly as he reached the major provisions. "To my daughter-in-law, Eleni Crawford, I leave the vacation home in Miami Beach, Florida, along with all furnishings and the sum of $200,000 for its maintenance and upkeep." The air seemed to leave my lungs. The Miami house had been our dream. Henry and I had bought it 15 years ago, planning to retire there together. We'd spent every anniversary there, walking the beach at sunset, talking about growing old by the ocean. Eleni's sharp intake of breath cut through my shock. She gripped Michael's arm, her perfectly veneered smile stretching across her face. "Oh my God, Michael, the Miami house!" "And to my son, Michael Crawford," Morrison continued, "I leave the family home here in Cleveland, along with the rental properties on Elm Street, and the sum of $300,000. Our house. The home where Michael had taken his first steps, where I'd nursed him through childhood illnesses, where Henry and I had dreamed of watching our grandchildren play in the backyard. Gone. Just like that, the room felt like it was spinning. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to stay steady. This couldn't be right. Henry would never leave me homeless. We'd talked about our wills just 2 years ago, and he'd promised I'd always be taken care of. "And finally," Morrison said, his voice growing gentler, "to my beloved wife, Joanne Crawford, I leave all personal effects, photographs, and keepsakes, along with the sum of $25,000 and my heartfelt gratitude for a lifetime of devotion." $25,000. After 42 years of marriage, that's what I was worth. Less than Eleni got for a house I'd helped choose, helped decorate, helped pay for. The silence in the room was deafening. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting for my reaction. My hands trembled as I reached for my purse, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. That's when Eleni's laughter shattered the quiet. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, I guess that settles who Henry really valued, doesn't it? She turned to Michael, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. Honey, should we start planning the renovations for the Miami place? I'm thinking we could turn the master suite into something more modern. Get rid of all those old-fashioned touches. Those old-fashioned touches were mine. The vintage wallpaper I'd carefully selected. The antique vanity where I'd gotten ready for countless romantic dinners with Henry. The reading nook where we'd spent lazy Sunday mornings with coffee and newspapers. Elaney, Michael said quietly, his voice strained. Maybe we could talk about this later. But she was just getting started. She stood up and walked around the table, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown to my humiliation. Oh, Joanne, she said, placing her hand on my shoulder in a gesture that looked caring but felt like claws. I know this must be hard for you, but you have to understand. Henry knew what he was doing. He knew Michael and I could take better care of his legacy. Legacy. As if Henry was just a collection of properties and bank accounts. The Miami house needs young blood, she continued, her grip tightening on my shoulder. Someone who can really appreciate it. Someone who can throw proper parties, entertain the right kind of people. You understand, don't you? It's not really suited for someone your age anyway. The cruelty in her voice was like a physical blow. Around the table, Henry's family shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. No one defended me. Elaney, please, I managed to whisper. Oh, don't worry about the family home either, she steamrolled on. Michael and I have so many plans. We're thinking of knocking down that wall between the kitchen and dining room, create more of an open concept. And honestly, the master bedroom is so dated. All those family photos everywhere. It's like living in a museum. She was talking about erasing me. Erasing 42 years of memories, of love, of the life Henry and I had built together. The rental properties will give us such good income too, she prattled on. We can finally take that European vacation we've been planning. Michael's always wanted to see Italy, haven't you, honey? Michael looked sick. His face had gone pale, and he couldn't meet my eyes. Elaney, stop. Stop what? I'm just excited about our future. She turned back to me, her smile sharp as glass. And Joanne, $25,000. That's quite generous, really? Enough to get you set up in a nice little apartment somewhere. Maybe one of those senior living communities. They have activities and everything. The room spun around me. Senior living communities. She was talking about putting me away, out of sight, out of mind. The woman who had married my son was systematically dismantling my entire life, and she was enjoying every minute of it. But something inside me refused to break. Maybe it was Henry's voice in my memory, telling me I was stronger than I knew. Maybe it was pure stubbornness. Whatever it was, I felt my spine straighten. I looked up at her, this woman who had weaseled her way into my family, and I smiled. Actually, Elaney, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. There's someone you need to meet first. The triumph in her eyes flickered. What do you mean? Before you make all those renovation plans, before you start spending that inheritance money, there's someone very important who's been waiting to have a conversation with all of you. The room went dead quiet. Morrison looked confused, shuffling through his papers. Michael frowned, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Elaney looked uncertain. What are you talking about, Joanne? She asked, her voice losing some of its smugness. I stood up slowly, smoothing down my black dress, the one Henry had bought me last Christmas because he said it made me look elegant. Well, dear, I said, savoring the moment. It seems Henry had one more surprise for all of us. At that exact moment, as if summoned by my words, the conference room door opened with a soft click. A man I'd never seen before stepped into the room. The stranger who entered the conference room was tall and distinguished, probably in his 50s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He carried a leather briefcase and moved with the quiet confidence of someone who dealt with important matters every day. I apologize for the interruption, he said, his voice warm but professional. I'm David Thompson from Thompson Hartwell & Associates. I believe Mrs. Crawford is expecting me. Everyone turned to stare at me. Elaine's mouth had fallen open, her perfectly glossed lips forming a small O of confusion. Michael looked between me and the stranger like he was watching a tennis match. Even Morrison seemed baffled, shuffling through his papers as if he'd missed something important. I stood up straighter, feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Control. Yes, Mr. Thompson. Right on time. But to understand how we got to this moment, I need to tell you about the last 2 years of Henry's life. About how the man I'd loved for 42 years slowly became a stranger, and how I almost lost myself in the process. It started small, like most devastating things do. Little changes that seemed innocent enough at first. Henry began forgetting names of neighbors we'd known for decades. He'd lose his keys, his wallet, sometimes his train of thought mid-sentence. The doctor said it was normal aging, maybe early signs of mild cognitive decline. Nothing to worry about too much. But Elaine saw an opportunity. She'd married Michael 6 years ago, and from the beginning, I knew she wasn't what she seemed. She was beautiful in that expensive, maintained way. Perfect teeth, perfect hair, perfect clothes. But her eyes were cold, calculating. She smiled at all the right moments and said all the right things, but there was something hollow underneath. Henry, bless his heart, tried to love her because she was Michael's choice. But I caught him watching her sometimes, that little frown creasing his forehead like he was trying to solve a puzzle. There's something off about that girl, he'd whisper to me in bed after family dinners. She asks too many questions about money. He was right. Elaine was always probing. How much was the house worth? What were Henry's retirement savings? Did we have life insurance? What about the Miami property? She disguised it as concern for our well-being, but Henry and I both felt the predatory nature of her interest. When the memory issues got worse, Elaine transformed. Suddenly, she was the devoted daughter-in-law, showing up at our house with casseroles and concerned smiles. She'd sit next to Henry, speaking slowly and loudly like he was a child. "Dad," she'd say, and I hated when she called him that. "You seem confused today. Are you taking your medication?" Henry would get frustrated, which made him seem more confused, which gave Elaine more ammunition. She started suggesting to Michael that maybe his father needed professional help. "It's not safe for him to be driving," she'd say. "What if he gets lost? What if he hurts someone? Maybe Mom can't handle taking care of him by herself anymore," she'd add, looking at me with fake sympathy. This is such a burden for her. Burden. As if caring for the man I loved was some terrible hardship instead of a privilege. The worst part was watching Michael believe her. My son, who'd grown up seeing how much Henry and I loved each other, started looking at his father with pity instead of respect. He began talking about us like we weren't in the room. "Maybe Elaine's right, Mom," he'd say after Henry had gone to bed. "Maybe Dad needs more structured care." "He's fine," I'd insist. "He has good days and bad days, but he's still your father." But Elaine was relentless. She'd come over when I was at my book club or grocery shopping, spending time alone with Henry. She'd ask him about finances, about his will, about his wishes for the future. And Henry, in his confused state, would try to answer her questions, not understanding that she was gathering information like a spy. One afternoon, I came home early from the library to find Elaine sitting at our kitchen table with a notepad. Henry across from her looking exhausted and bewildered. "What's going on here?" I asked. Elaine looked up with that bright, fake smile. "Oh, just helping Dad organize some of his thoughts. He was telling me about his wishes for the family, weren't you, Dad?" Henry looked between us, clearly distressed. "I don't remember what I was saying." "That's okay," Elaine said sweetly. "We can talk more later." That night, Henry was agitated. He kept pacing around the bedroom, running his hands through his hair. "Joanne, I think I said something wrong today, to Elaine, but I can't remember what." I held him close, feeling his trembling. "It's okay, sweetheart. Whatever it was, it's okay." But it wasn't okay. Because I was starting to realize that Elaine wasn't just taking advantage of Henry's confusion, she was making it worse on purpose. She'd ask him the same questions over and over, confusing him when his answers changed. She'd bring up topics that upset him, then act concerned when he got agitated. She was systematically undermining his confidence in his own mind. And Michael didn't see it. Or maybe he didn't want to see it. His wife had convinced him that she was helping, that she cared about our family's well-being. He started spending less time with us, letting Eleni handle the difficult conversations about Henry's condition. The final blow came 8 months before Henry died. Eleni convinced Michael that we needed to have Henry's will updated because his mental state made the old will potentially invalid. She brought her own lawyer, not Morrison, who'd handled our family's legal matters for years, but some young hotshot who specialized in elder law. It's for his own protection, she insisted. We want to make sure his wishes are clearly documented while he can still express them. I should have fought harder. I should have insisted on our own lawyer, should have demanded to be present for every conversation. But I was tired. So tired from watching my husband slip away piece by piece, from fighting battles I didn't understand, from feeling like the villain in my own family's story. Henry signed the new will on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at physical therapy for my arthritis. When I came home, he was sitting in his chair, staring at nothing. "What did you do today, honey?" I asked. He looked at me with such sadness in his eyes. "I think I signed something important, but I can't remember what it was." That was the beginning of the end. After signing that will, Henry seemed to give up fighting the confusion. He stopped trying to remember names or dates. He stopped getting frustrated when he couldn't find the right words. He just surrendered. The night he died, I held his hand in the hospital bed while he struggled to breathe. His last words were whispered so softly, I had to lean close to hear them. "Joanne, the papers. Not what I wanted. Protect yourself." I thought he was just confused again, rambling about something that didn't make sense. Now I knew better. Now, standing in Morrison's conference room with David Thompson's calm presence behind me, I understood what Henry had been trying to tell me. He'd known what Eleni was doing. Even in his confused state, he'd seen through her manipulation, and he'd done something about it. Mr. Thompson set his briefcase on the table and looked around the room with professional courtesy. "I believe there may be some confusion about Mr. Crawford's final wishes. I'm here to clarify the situation." Eleni found her voice first, though it came out higher than usual. "I'm sorry, but who exactly are you? We've just finished reading Henry's will with his longtime attorney. Everything's been settled." Thompson smiled gently. "I'm afraid not, Mrs. Crawford. You see, what you've just heard was Mr. Crawford's old will, the one he signed under duress 8 months ago. I'm here to present his true final will and testament, the one he executed in secret just 3 weeks before his death." The color drained from Eleni's face. Michael looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Around the table, Henry's family leaned forward, sensing that everything was about to change. And in that moment, I felt Henry's presence so strongly it took my breath away. My brilliant, loving husband had outmaneuvered them all. The silence in Morrison's conference room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. David Thompson opened his briefcase with practiced calm, pulling out documents that looked far more official than anything we'd seen so far. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, like a man who held all the cards and knew it. Morrison cleared his throat nervously. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson, but I don't understand. I've been the Crawford family attorney for over 15 years. I have Henry's properly executed will right here." Thompson looked up from his papers, his expression sympathetic but firm. "Mr. Morrison, I understand your confusion. However, what you have is indeed a will that Mr. Crawford signed 8 months ago, but it wasn't his final will. And more importantly, it wasn't executed under circumstances that would make it legally valid." Eleni's perfectly manicured hand gripped the edge of the table. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Michael shot her a warning look. "Eleni, please." But she was beyond caring about appearances now. Her mask was slipping, revealing the calculating woman underneath. "This is ridiculous. Henry signed that will. I was there. Michael was there. It's completely legal." Thompson nodded thoughtfully. "You're quite right that Mr. Crawford signed a document 8 months ago. However, Mrs. Crawford, the younger Mrs. Crawford, I should inform you that under Ohio state law, a will signed by someone under undue influence or lacking mental capacity can be deemed invalid." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud about to burst. I felt my heart hammering against my ribs. hope and fear warring in my chest. Could this really be happening? Had Henry somehow found a way to protect me from beyond the grave? That's preposterous, Eleni snapped. Henry was perfectly capable of making his own decisions. Ask anyone in this family. Thompson's smile was gentle but steel underneath. Actually, Mrs. Crawford, that's exactly what we did. He pulled out a thick folder and opened it to reveal what looked like medical records. 3 weeks before his death, Mr. Crawford contacted me through a mutual acquaintance. He was quite concerned about certain pressures he'd been experiencing regarding his estate planning. My hands started trembling. I remembered those last weeks, how Henry had seemed more agitated than usual, how he'd asked me strange questions about whether I trusted certain family members. I'd thought it was just the confusion getting worse. Mr. Crawford asked me to arrange for a comprehensive mental evaluation by Dr. Sarah Chen, a geriatric psychiatrist with over 20 years of experience in capacity assessments. Thompson pulled out another document. Dr. Chen's evaluation, conducted over 3 separate sessions, concluded that while Mr. Crawford did have some memory issues consistent with early-stage dementia, he retained full testamentary capacity. He understood the nature and extent of his property. He understood the natural objects of his bounty, that's his family members, and he was able to form a rational plan for the disposition of his estate. Morrison leaned forward, his professional curiosity overriding the awkwardness of the situation. And this evaluation was conducted recently? 2.5 weeks before Mr. Crawford's death, Thompson confirmed. Dr. Chen was very thorough. She also noted signs that Mr. Crawford felt he had been pressured or manipulated in previous legal decisions. Her report specifically mentions his distress about a will he'd signed months earlier that didn't reflect his true wishes. I thought I might faint. Henry had known. Somehow, through all the confusion and manipulation, he'd known what was happening to him and he'd fought back. Eleni was on her feet now, her face flushed with anger and panic. This is impossible. You can't just waltz in here with some fake documents and overturn a perfectly legal will. I won't let you destroy this family over some senile old man's delusions. The cruelty in her voice cut through the room like a blade. Around the table, Henry's family recoiled from her words. Even Michael looked stricken by his wife's callousness. But Thompson remained unflappably calm. Mrs. Crawford, I understand you're upset. These situations are always difficult. However, I should point out that questioning Mr. Crawford's mental state actually supports our position. If he was as incapacitated as you suggest, then the will you've just heard read would itself be invalid due to lack of capacity. Eleni's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She'd just undermined her own argument. Thompson continued with professional precision. Furthermore, Dr. Chen's evaluation included several sessions where Mr. Crawford discussed his previous will. He was quite clear that he'd felt pressured to sign it, that certain family members had made him feel guilty about providing for his wife, and that he'd been told repeatedly that his memory problems meant he couldn't trust his own judgment about family matters. Each word hit Eleni like a physical blow. Michael had gone pale, staring at his wife like he was seeing her for the first time. Henry specifically told Dr. Chen, Thompson went on, that he'd been made to believe that his wife couldn't handle inheritance responsibilities, that she was too old to manage properties, and that the younger generation would be better stewards of his legacy. He was quite distressed about having betrayed his life partner under this pressure. Tears were streaming down my face now. Henry had remembered, despite everything they'd done to confuse him, to make him doubt himself, he'd remembered what mattered most. Thompson opened his briefcase again and withdrew a sealed envelope. This is Mr. Crawford's true final will, executed properly under Ohio law with Dr. Chen serving as one witness and myself as another. It was signed in my office with full video documentation of Mr. Crawford's mental clarity and understanding of his decisions. Morrison looked like a man watching his entire career crumble. I had no idea. Mrs. Crawford, the younger Mrs. Crawford, she brought me the first will, said it needed to be updated for Henry's protection. She seemed so concerned about his welfare. I'm sure she did, Thompson said dryly. Mr. Crawford was quite specific about that manipulation as well. He described feeling isolated from his wife during these legal discussions, being told that financial matters were too complicated for Mrs. Crawford to understand, and being pressured to make decisions quickly before his condition worsened. Eleni sank back into her chair, her face ashen. The confident, manipulative woman who'd been gloating about my humiliation just minutes ago looked like a deflated balloon. Michael finally found his voice. "What does the real will say?" Thompson looked at me, and I saw something like respect in his eyes. The primary beneficiary of Mr. Crawford's estate is his wife Joanne, as it should be after 42 years of marriage. Mrs. Crawford receives the family home, the Miami property, the rental properties, and the bulk of the financial assets. The room seemed to spin around me. I gripped the edge of the table, hardly daring to believe what I was hearing. Mr. Crawford left specific provisions for his son Michael, Thompson continued, $25,000 and some personal items, with a note that this inheritance would increase substantially if Michael demonstrates that he can make decisions independently of certain influences in his life. Michael's face crumpled. He understood exactly what his father meant. As for Mrs. Eleni Crawford, Thompson's voice carried just a hint of disapproval. Mr. Crawford left her precisely what she deserves for her concern about his welfare, $1 and the recommendation that she seek employment that doesn't involve exploiting vulnerable elderly people. Eleni let out a strangled cry. "You can't do this. I've spent 6 years in this family. I've taken care of Henry. You've manipulated and abused him," I said quietly, finding my voice at last. And Henry knew it. Thompson nodded gravely. Mr. Crawford was very specific about documenting the manipulation he'd experienced. He provided detailed accounts of being pressured during his vulnerable moments, of having his memory problems weaponized against him, and of watching his wife be systematically excluded from family decisions about their shared life. He pulled out one final document. In fact, he was so concerned about potential challenges to his will that he recorded a video statement explaining his decisions. "Would you like to see it?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around the table, everyone held their breath, waiting to see if they were brave enough to hear Henry's voice from beyond the grave, speaking his truth about what they'd all allowed to happen. Eleni was shaking her head frantically. No, this is all lies. Henry loved me. He trusted me. I was the only one who understood what he needed. But Michael was staring at Thompson with something like desperate hope. "Yes," he whispered. "I want to see it. I need to see it." And so we prepared to hear from Henry one last time. David Thompson set up a small tablet on the conference room table with the reverence of someone handling sacred relics. The screen reflected the overhead lights as he adjusted the angle so everyone could see clearly. My heart hammered so hard, I was sure the whole room could hear it. In moments, I would see Henry again, hear his voice, watch him speak his truth. This video was recorded 2 weeks before Mr. Crawford's death, Thompson explained, his finger hovering over the play button. He was very insistent that his family understand his decisions, particularly if anyone attempted to challenge his will. Eleni had shrunk back in her chair like she was trying to disappear entirely. Michael leaned forward, his face a mixture of dread and desperate hope. The rest of Henry's family sat in stunned silence, still processing the bombshell that had just exploded their assumptions about inheritance and family loyalty. Thompson pressed play, and suddenly, Henry was there. He looked frailer than I remembered, sitting in what I recognized as Thompson's office. But his eyes were clear and focused in a way I hadn't seen in his final months at home. He wore his best blue shirt, the one I'd bought him for our 40th anniversary, and his hair was neatly combed. He looked directly into the camera with the same steady gaze that had fallen in love with 43 years ago. "My name is Henry William Crawford." His voice came through the tablet's speakers, strong and sure. "Today is October 1st. And I'm recording this statement to explain my final will and testament, in case anyone tries to question my mental capacity or my decisions." Tears immediately blurred my vision, but I couldn't look away. This was Henry, as he truly was, not the confused, manipulated man he'd become at home. First, I want to be clear about my mental state. Yes, I have some memory problems. Sometimes I forget names or get confused about dates. But I know exactly who I am. I know my family, and I understand completely what I'm doing with my property. He paused, and I could see him gathering his thoughts with careful precision. I need to explain why I'm making this video. For the past year and a half, I've been systematically manipulated by my daughter-in-law, Eleni Crawford. She has taken advantage of my memory issues to isolate me from my wife, pressure me into legal decisions I didn't want to make, and convince my son that I was incapable of managing my own affairs. Michael made a choking sound beside me. On the screen, Henry continued with devastating clarity. Eleni would visit when Joanne was out of the house. She'd ask me the same confusing questions over and over until I got frustrated and seemed confused. Then she'd tell my son that I was getting worse, that I needed help, that Joanne couldn't handle taking care of me. My hands clenched into fists. Henry had known. He'd seen through every manipulation, even when his mind was failing him in other ways. She convinced me to sign a will that left most of my property to her and Michael. She told me that Joanne was too old to handle real estate, that the Miami house would be too much work for her, that young people could take better care of my legacy. She made me feel guilty for wanting to provide for my wife after 42 years of marriage. Henry's voice grew stronger, more determined. But here's what Eleni didn't know. I may forget where I put my keys, but I remember what matters. I remember every sacrifice Joanne made for our family. I remember how she worked 2 jobs when Michael was small so I could finish my apprenticeship. I remember how she took care of my parents when they got sick, never complaining, always patient. I remember 42 years of love, loyalty, and partnership. Across the table, Robert was wiping his eyes. Patricia had her hand pressed to her mouth. Even Morrison looked moved by Henry's words. Eleni thought she was dealing with a confused old man who didn't understand his own mind. She was wrong. I understand perfectly. I understand that my wife deserves to be cared for in her old age the same way she cared for everyone else her whole life. I understand that the house we bought together, the vacation home we dreamed of retiring to, the properties we invested in, those belong to her, not to some manipulative woman who married into this family 6 years ago. Henry shifted in his chair, and I could see the effort it took for him to speak so clearly for so long. But his determination never wavered. I also want to address my son Michael directly. Henry looked straight into the camera, and I felt like he was speaking to Michael's soul. Son, I love you. I always have and I always will. But you've let your wife convince you that your father was losing his mind, and you use that as an excuse to stop fighting for what's right. You stopped defending your mother. You stopped questioning Eleni's motives. You took the easy path and let someone else make the hard decisions. Michael was crying openly now, his shoulders shaking. Eleni sat frozen beside him, her face a mask of terror. The reduced inheritance I've left you isn't punishment, Michael. It's a chance to prove that you can think for yourself, that you can recognize manipulation when you see it, that you can choose your family's well-being over your wife's greed. If you can do that, if you can show me that you've learned to value the right things, then your inheritance will reflect that growth. Henry paused again, looking tired but resolute. As for Eleni, I'm leaving her exactly what she's earned through her treatment of my wife and her manipulation of my illness. $1. Not because I'm cruel, but because actions have consequences. She saw a vulnerable old man and decided to exploit him. She saw a devoted wife and decided to push her aside. She gambled that I was too confused to understand what she was doing. She lost that bet. The room was dead silent except for the sound of Michael's quiet sobs. Even Eleni seemed too shocked to speak. Henry's image leaned forward slightly, his expression growing gentler. Joanne, if you're watching this, I need you to know something. Every day of our marriage has been a gift. You've been my partner, my best friend, my anchor in every storm. The idea that you couldn't handle your own inheritance, that you needed other people to make decisions about our shared life, that was never my belief. That was their manipulation talking, and I should have been stronger in resisting it. I was crying so hard now that Thompson pushed a box of tissues toward me. On the screen, My husband continued his final message. I want you to live in our house for as long as you want to. I want you to enjoy the Miami place we picked out together, to watch the sunsets we dreamed about. I want you to use the rental income to travel, to spend time with people who value you, to do all the things we planned before I got sick. Henry's voice grew softer, more intimate. Most of all, I want you to know that you were never a burden. Taking care of me wasn't a sacrifice you made. It was love in action. And it was the greatest privilege of my life to be loved that completely by someone that wonderful. The video continued for a few more minutes, with Henry methodically explaining each provision of his will and his reasons for making those choices, but I barely heard the legal details. I was too overwhelmed by the flood of emotions, grief, vindication, love, and a strange sense of peace. When the video ended, the silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Finally, Thompson closed the tablet and looked around the room. As you can see, Mr. Crawford was quite clear about his mental capacity and his intentions. This will has been properly executed according to Ohio state law, witnessed by qualified individuals, and backed by professional medical evaluation. Any attempt to challenge it would be both expensive and ultimately unsuccessful. Eleni found her voice at last, but it came out as barely a whisper. He couldn't have done this. He was too confused. I was helping him. Thompson's expression was professionally neutral, but I caught a flash of disgust in his eyes. Mrs. Crawford, your definition of help apparently included isolating a vulnerable man from his wife, pressuring him into legal decisions that benefited you, and systematically undermining his confidence in his own judgment. In most jurisdictions, that behavior has a name. It's called elder abuse. Michael finally looked up from his hands, his face streaked with tears. Mom, he said, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry. I should have seen it. I should have protected you both. The apology I'd been waiting years to hear finally came, but it felt hollow now. Too little. Too late. Still, I could see genuine remorse in his eyes, real recognition of what he'd allowed to happen. I need some air, Eleni announced suddenly, standing up so fast her chair rolled backward. This is all insane. You can't just change everything based on some video. Thompson stood as well, his voice taking on a harder edge. Actually, Mrs. Crawford, we can and we have. The will has been filed with the probate court. The properties and accounts are being transferred as Mr. Crawford directed. You have no legal standing to challenge these decisions, and frankly, any attempt to do so would likely result in a countersuit for elder abuse and undue influence. Eleni looked around the room like a trapped animal, seeking support she wasn't going to find. Henry's family was staring at her with mixtures of disgust and pity. Morrison was studiously avoiding her gaze. Even Michael couldn't look at her anymore. This isn't over, she hissed. But her voice lacked conviction. Thompson smiled coldly. Actually, Mrs. Crawford, I believe it is. As Eleni stormed out of the conference room, slamming the door behind her, I realized that Henry had given me something more valuable than property or money. He'd given me back my dignity, my place in my own family, and the knowledge that our love had been real and recognized even at the very end. The war wasn't quite over yet, but the most important battle had been won. The week that followed the reading of Henry's true will passed in a strange blur of legal paperwork and family phone calls. David Thompson had been efficient and thorough, ensuring that all the property transfers were processed quickly and correctly. By Friday afternoon, I was officially the owner of our family home, the Miami Beach House, and the 3 rental properties on Elm Street. But Eleni wasn't finished fighting. I should have expected her to make one last desperate move, but I suppose I was still naive about the depths of her manipulation. She'd been quiet since storming out of Morrison's office, and Michael had moved back into our family home temporarily while they figured things out. I thought maybe she was finally accepting reality. I was wrong. It was Tuesday evening when she made her play. I was in Henry's study, going through his personal papers and trying to decide what to keep and what to donate, when I heard a car pull into the driveway. Through the window, I saw Eleni getting out of her silver BMW, but she wasn't alone. A man in an expensive suit followed her up the walkway. Someone I didn't recognize but who carried himself with the aggressive confidence of a certain type of lawyer. I met them at the front door before they could ring the bell. Eleni looked different somehow, harder, more desperate. Her usually perfect hair was slightly disheveled, and her makeup couldn't quite hide the dark circles under her eyes. "Joanne," she said, her voice artificially sweet, but with an undercurrent of steel. "We need to talk." "I don't think we have anything to discuss," I replied, keeping my hand on the doorknob. I wasn't about to invite her into Henry's house, my house, after everything she'd done. The man beside her stepped forward, extending a business card. "Mrs. Crawford, I'm Richard Blackwood from Blackwood, Sterling and Associates. I represent Mrs. Eleni Crawford in this matter." I glanced at the card but didn't take it. "What matter?" "The will has been probated. Everything's settled." Eleni's mask slipped slightly, showing the fury underneath. "Nothing's settled, Joanne. That video, that so-called will, it's all fraud. Henry was being manipulated by that Thompson character, just like he was manipulated by you for 40 years. The accusation hit like a slap. "Excuse me?" Blackwood cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with his client's approach. "What Mrs. Crawford means is that we believe there are grounds to challenge the validity of the recent will based on undue influence and questions about the circumstances under which it was created." I looked between them, feeling a familiar mixture of exhaustion and anger. "Henry made that video with a doctor present to verify his mental capacity. He explained every decision clearly. What exactly are you planning to challenge?" Eleni stepped closer, and I could smell the desperation on her like cheap perfume. "I have evidence that you and this Thompson lawyer conspired to take advantage of Henry's condition. I know you've been planning this for months, probably years. You couldn't stand the idea that Henry finally saw through your manipulation and tried to protect his real family." Her words were so divorced from reality that I almost laughed. Almost. But the serious expression on Blackwood's face told me they weren't bluffing about taking legal action. "What evidence?" I asked quietly. Eleni's eyes gleamed with triumph. "Phone records showing dozens of calls between you and Thompson's office over the past 6 months. Bank records showing payments to Dr. Chen. Documentation of how you isolated Henry from his family during his final weeks, keeping him away from people who cared about him." Each lie was so twisted from the truth that it took my breath away. The phone calls to Thompson's office had been Henry's idea, made when I was out of the house because he didn't want to worry me. The payment to Dr. Chen had come from Henry's own account, arranged by Thompson, and the isolation she was describing, that had been her doing, not mine. But I could see how it might look to someone who didn't know the full story. A widow suddenly inheriting everything, working with lawyers her family had never heard of, having her husband evaluated by doctors they'd never met. In the wrong hands, the narrative could be twisted to make me look like the manipulator. "You're lying," I said, but I could hear the uncertainty in my own voice. Blackwood spoke up, his tone professionally neutral. "Mrs. Crawford, we're not here to make accusations. We simply believe that a more thorough investigation of the circumstances surrounding your husband's final will would be beneficial for all parties involved." "What do you want?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Eleni smiled, and it was the cold, calculating expression I'd seen so many times before. "A settlement. We split everything 50-50. You keep the family home, I keep Miami. We each take half the rental properties and half the financial assets. It's fair, and it avoids a long, expensive court battle that could destroy this family's reputation." Fair. The word tasted like poison in my mouth. After everything she'd done, all the manipulation and abuse, she wanted me to hand over half of what Henry had fought so hard to leave me. And if I refuse, Blackwood pulled a thick folder from his briefcase. "Then we file suit tomorrow morning. Undue influence, fraud, elder abuse, against you this time. We'll demand a full investigation of every decision made regarding Mr. Crawford's care and legal affairs in his final year. Every doctor's visit, every lawyer meeting, every financial transaction will be scrutinized. The process could take years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees." The threat was clear. Even if I ultimately won, The fight would consume my time, my money, and what remained of my family relationships. Eleni was betting that I'd rather give up half of Henry's legacy than spend my remaining years in court battles. I need to think about it, I said finally. You have until tomorrow at 5 p.m., Eleni replied. After that, we file the lawsuit and things get much more complicated. They turned to leave, but Eleni paused at the bottom of the porch steps. Oh, and Joanne? You might want to call Michael. He's very upset about all this uncertainty. It would be terrible if these legal problems drove another wedge between you and your son. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. She was going to use Michael against me, make him believe that I was being stubborn and vindictive by not settling. After everything we'd been through, she was still trying to manipulate my relationship with my own child. I watched them drive away, then closed the door and leaned against it, my heart racing. For a moment, doubt crept in. Maybe I should just settle. Maybe fighting wasn't worth the risk of losing everything in court, of spending my golden years in depositions and hearings. Then I looked around Henry's study, our study, at the photos of our life together, at the chair where he'd spent countless evenings reading to me, at the desk where he'd written love letters during our courtship. Henry hadn't gone through all that planning, all that pain of documenting Eleni's abuse, just so I could hand over half of everything to his tormentor the moment she threatened a fight. I walked over to his desk and picked up the phone. But I didn't call the settlement lawyers or start negotiating terms of surrender. I called David Thompson. Mr. Thompson, I said when he answered, my voice steadier than I felt. I think it's time to show Eleni exactly who she's been underestimating. When I told him about Eleni's threat and her deadline, Thompson was quiet for a long moment. Then he chuckled, a sound that held no humor but plenty of grim satisfaction. Mrs. Crawford, he said. I was hoping she'd try something like this. Your husband was a very thorough man. He anticipated that Mrs. Eleni Crawford might attempt to challenge his will, and he made sure we'd be prepared. What do you mean? I mean that threatening you was the worst mistake she could have made, because now we get to show her the evidence Henry collected about her real activities over the past 2 years. Evidence that makes undue influence look like a parking ticket compared to what she's actually guilty of. As Thompson explained what Henry had been documenting in secret, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The thrill of being on the winning side of a fight that actually mattered. Eleni thought she was checkmating me with her threats and ultimatums. She had no idea that Henry had been playing chess while she was still learning checkers. Tomorrow at 5 p.m. was going to be very interesting indeed. Wednesday at 4:30 p.m., I sat in David Thompson's conference room with a calmness I hadn't felt in years. Thompson had spent the morning showing me exactly what Henry had been documenting during those final months. Evidence so damning that even Eleni's expensive lawyer would have to recommend immediate surrender. Henry hadn't just been aware of Eleni's manipulation. He'd been systematically recording it. The folder Thompson spread across the table contained audio recordings from a small device Henry had hidden in his shirt pocket during Eleni's caring visits. Hours of her voice, sometimes sweet and concerned, sometimes frustrated and cruel, always probing for financial information and ways to undermine my relationship with my own husband. Your wife doesn't understand business matters, Dad. It's better if we handle these complicated decisions. Don't tell Joanne about this conversation. She gets so worried about money, and stress isn't good for someone her age. You know she's been making mistakes with the household accounts. Maybe it's time to think about who should really be handling your finances. Each recording was time-stamped and documented. Henry had also kept detailed notes about how he felt before and after these sessions, how Eleni would time her visits for when I was out, how she'd ask the same confusing questions repeatedly until he became agitated. But the most damaging evidence was what Thompson showed me next. A series of emails between Eleni and someone named Marcus Rivera, discussing investment opportunities that would be available once she gained control of the Crawford assets. She was already planning how to spend your husband's money before he was even dead, Thompson said grimly. These emails discuss liquidating the rental properties, selling the Miami house to developers, and investing the proceeds in her boyfriend's construction business. Boyfriend. The word hit me like a physical blow. While she was playing the devoted daughter-in-law, Eleni had been conducting an affair and planning to use Henry's estate to fund her lover's business ventures. At exactly 5 p.m., Eleni arrived with Blackwood and another man I didn't recognize. Probably another lawyer to help intimidate me into settling. She walked into the conference room with the confidence of someone who believed she held all the cards. That confidence evaporated the moment Thompson pressed play on the first audio recording. Eleni's own voice filled the room. "Dad, you need to understand that Joanne can't handle this kind of responsibility. She's getting older, and frankly, she's never been very bright about financial matters. It would be cruel to burden her with decisions she can't understand." The color drained from her face as she heard herself systematically undermining a devoted wife to her confused husband. Blackwood looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. The third lawyer was frantically taking notes, probably calculating how quickly he could distance himself from this disaster. "This is illegal recording," Eleni whispered. "You can't use this." Thompson smiled coldly. "Actually, Ohio is a one-party consent state. Mr. Crawford had every right to record conversations in his own home, especially when he felt he was being manipulated or abused." He played the next recording, where Eleni's mask slipped completely and her true feelings about our family came pouring out. "Honestly, Dad, I don't know how you've stood being married to such a pathetic woman for 40 years. She's like a little mouse, scurrying around, never contributing anything meaningful. Michael and I could give you the kind of life you deserve." Hearing her talk about me that way, hearing the contempt in her voice for my husband and our marriage, I felt something cold and final settle in my chest. Any possibility of forgiveness, any chance of family reconciliation, died in that moment. But Thompson wasn't finished. He pulled out the printed emails between Eleni and Marcus Rivera. "This is what Mrs. Eleni Crawford was really planning," he said, sliding the papers across to Blackwood. "An affair with Mr. Rivera, liquidation of the Crawford estate, and investment in construction projects that would benefit her personally while leaving the family with nothing." Blackwood read the emails, his face growing paler with each page. When he finished, he set the papers down and looked at his client with something approaching horror. "Eleni," he said carefully, "I think we need to discuss our options privately." But Eleni was past caring about legal strategy. She was trapped and desperate people make terrible decisions. "You think you're so smart," she hissed at me. "You think you've won something, but you're still just a pathetic old woman who's going to die alone while I'm young enough to start over." Thompson leaned forward. "Mrs. Crawford, I'd strongly advise you to stop talking," but she couldn't stop. Years of hidden resentment came pouring out like poison from a lanced wound. "Do you want to know the truth?" Henry was relieved when he signed that first will. "He told me he was tired of pretending you were still the woman he married. He said you'd become a burden, a sad old woman clinging to a man who'd outgrown you." The lie was so cruel, so calculated to hurt me, that it actually had the opposite effect. Instead of devastating me, it revealed the depths of her cruelty and made me feel sorry for her. This was what she'd become. A woman so consumed with greed and selfishness that she'd say anything to wound someone who'd never done her harm. "Are you finished?" I asked quietly. My calm seemed to unnerve her more than anger would have. She'd expected me to break down, to fight back, to give her some emotional satisfaction. Instead, I just looked at her with pity. Thompson cleared his throat. "Given what we've heard today, I think it's time to discuss the real terms of this situation. Mrs. Eleni Crawford, you have exactly two choices. You can sign a document agreeing to never contest Mr. Crawford's will, never contact Mrs. Joanne Crawford again, and accept your $1 inheritance with grace. In exchange, we won't pursue criminal charges for elder abuse or report your fraud attempts to the State Bar Association. Or, Blackwood asked weakly, or we file criminal complaints tomorrow morning and let the district attorney decide whether Mrs. Eleni Crawford's actions constitute felony elder abuse. The recordings and emails provide more than sufficient evidence for prosecution. A conviction would mean potential jail time and permanent prohibition from inheriting from any estate in Ohio." Eleni looked around the room like a cornered animal, but there was nowhere to run. Her expensive lawyers couldn't argue with her own voice on tape. Her threats had crumbled in the face of actual evidence. "I need to discuss this with my client," Blackwood said. "You have 10 minutes, Thompson replied. "After that, the offer expires and we proceed with criminal referrals." They huddled in the hallway while Thompson and I waited in comfortable silence. I felt oddly peaceful, like I was watching the final act of a play I'd been forced to star in for too long. When they returned, Eleni's fight was gone. She signed the agreement without looking at me, her signature sharp and angry on the legal documents. Then she stood up, smoothed her designer dress, and walked out of my life forever. 3 months later, I stood on the balcony of the Miami beach house, watching the sunset paint the Gulf of Mexico in shades of gold and coral. The evening breeze carried the salt smell of the ocean and the distant sound of children playing on the beach. Michael had driven down from Cleveland the week before, his first visit since the will reading. We'd spent long hours talking on this same balcony, working through years of misunderstandings and hurt feelings. He was seeing a therapist, learning to recognize manipulation and set healthy boundaries. It would take time to fully heal our relationship, but we were both committed to the work. "I'm proud of Dad," he'd said on his last night there. "He protected you even when he couldn't protect himself. That takes real love." Henry's ashes sat in an urn on the living room mantel, but I felt his presence most strongly here on the balcony where we'd spent so many happy evenings planning our retirement dreams. Dreams that had seemed impossible during those dark months when Eleni was systematically destroying our family. The rental properties were providing more than enough income for a comfortable life. I'd hired a property management company to handle the day-to-day operations, giving me freedom to travel, to volunteer, to finally pursue hobbies I'd put aside during my caretaking years. Next week, I was flying to Ireland, something Henry and I had always talked about but never managed to do. I'd be traveling with a small group from the senior center, and for the first time in years, I was excited about the future instead of just surviving the present. My phone rang, interrupting my sunset meditation. The caller ID showed my sister Martha's number. "How's paradise?" she asked when I picked up. "Peaceful," I said, settling into my favorite beach chair. "Wonderfully, perfectly peaceful. Any word from you-know-who?" I smiled, watching a pelican dive for fish in the surf. "Not a word, and I hope it stays that way." Martha and I talked for another 20 minutes about family news and travel plans. After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness, listening to the eternal rhythm of the waves. Somewhere in Cleveland, Eleni was probably plotting her next scheme or nursing her resentment. I found that I genuinely didn't care. She'd lost the power to hurt me the moment Henry's truth came to light. Without that power, she was just another unhappy person making bad choices, someone to be pitied rather than feared. The house phone rang inside, but I didn't get up to answer it. The machine would catch it, and whatever it was could wait until tomorrow. Tonight was for gratitude, for remembering Henry's love, for appreciating the second chance I'd been given to live life on my own terms. As the stars began to appear over the water, I raised my glass of wine in a silent toast. To Henry, who'd loved me enough to fight for me even when his mind was failing. To the truth that had set us both free. To the future that stretched ahead like the endless horizon, full of possibilities I was finally free to explore. At 61, I was just beginning to understand what it meant to be truly, completely, joyfully free. And it was beautiful. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.